Welcome to Boring Pastimes, a place where history drifts as gently as the tide. Here, we tell stories not of battles and conquests, but of quiet lives, forgotten details, and the slow rhythm of the past. Settle in, let your thoughts soften, and allow these calm histories to carry you into rest. This is Boring History for Sleep. You are about to hear the story of a woman who would one day command hundreds of ships and thousands of men. Yet her beginnings were quiet and unassuming. Ching Shih's early life unfolded along the southern coast of China in Guangdong province, a region defined by fishing villages, small trading towns, and the constant ebb and flow of the South China Sea. Life here was ruled by routine, by tides, and by human resilience. Storms could sweep through overnight, taking lives and livelihoods, and the threat of pirates so familiar to the coastal population was ever present. It is within this setting of constant, subtle danger and quiet daily labor that Ching Shih learned the lessons that would later allow her to rule a pirate empire. Her family was ordinary and unremarkable. Historical records about her childhood are sparse, often reconstructed from later anecdotes and court records, yet they paint a picture of daily life filled with small, repetitive tasks: fetching water, preparing meals, tending to younger siblings, mending clothing, and assisting in whatever family trade sustained them. These tasks, though seemingly dull, cultivated patience, observation, and discipline, qualities crucial for survival in both domestic and maritime life. Ching Shih's parents likely adhered to the rhythms of trade and farming, instilling in her an understanding of schedules, measurement, and the importance of careful management. These ordinary experiences would later translate into extraordinary leadership abilities as a young woman. Ching Shih married a man named Zhang Yi, a captain within the Red Flag Fleet, one of the most organized pirate confederations along the South China coast. Contrary to popular imagination, these pirates were far from chaotic marauders. The fleet was disciplined, with rules governing conduct, hierarchical structures, and a system of punishments designed to maintain order. Ships were not simply floating fortresses of plunder. They were complex organizations requiring logistics, record-keeping, and careful attention to maintenance and supplies. Ching Shih entered this world initially as a wife, but her sharp mind and keen observations soon elevated her influence beyond the domestic sphere. Daily life aboard a pirate ship was a blend of laborious routine and constant vigilance. Sails frayed under the sun and salt, ropes needed repair, food supplies had to be rationed, and crew morale required constant attention. Unlike cinematic depictions of pirates, much of their time was consumed by repetitive maintenance tasks, record-keeping, and strategy meetings. Ching Shih watched, listened, and absorbed the rhythms of this environment, noting inefficiencies, identifying loyal followers, and understanding how authority could be exercised without unnecessary force. The fleet itself was governed by a code. Disputes over plunder were addressed through meetings and arbitration. There were punishments for desertion or theft, and rewards for loyalty and courage. A minor anecdote illustrates Ching Shih's early skill. She once mediated a disagreement among crew members about a small raid's spoils, resolving it with fairness rather than intimidation. Though it seems trivial, this earned her quiet respect. The world along the coast was equally structured. Fishing schedules, trade markets, and local governance dictated how people moved and lived. Villages depended on knowledge of tides, weather, and political pressures from the Qing government. Piracy existed not only as a challenge, but as a part of this economic ecosystem. Ching Shih learned the subtleties of negotiation, risk assessment, and human behavior in these environments. Observing how communities survived amidst constant threat, the quiet, repetitive nature of these tasks, the preparation of meals, the repair of nets, the management of minor disputes was crucial. They honed the patience and organizational skills Ching Shih would later use to unite hundreds of pirate ships under her command. It was in the minutiae of daily life, often dismissed as boring, that she learned discipline, authority, and strategy. As Ching, she moved further into her role alongside Zhang Yi. She began to notice the limitations of conventional leadership. Some captains ruled with fear, some with brute strength, but few understood the subtleties of human motivation, loyalty, and logistics. She quietly studied the fleet, observing which methods worked, which created tension, and which inspired commitment. Her early life of mundane labor, her exposure to disciplined domestic routines, and her observations aboard ships converged to give her an understanding of management few others possessed. Even within this life of labor and observation, challenges were constant. Supply shortages, the unpredictability of weather, and threats from both the Qing Navy and rival pirates demanded constant attention. Ching Shih learned to anticipate problems, plan contingencies, and make decisions under pressure skills, honed not in moments of drama but in the quiet calculation of daily necessity. Each small task, each careful negotiation, and each decision about fairness or discipline prepared her for the extraordinary responsibilities that lay ahead. By the time she reached her 20s, Ching Shih was more than just a captain's wife. She was a keen observer, a strategist in training, and a student of human nature. The quiet days spent repairing ropes, distributing rations, and mediating disputes may seem unremarkable, yet they were essential. They built the foundation for a leader capable of managing an empire of the seas, where hundreds of ships and thousands of men would look to her, not out of fear alone, but out of respect for her judgment and fairness. And yet, despite all these preparations, a question remained unanswered. How would a woman, in a male-dominated and dangerous world, rise to command such power and enforce her authority in a way that even the Imperial Navy could not undermine? It is this question, the unknown path from careful observation to extraordinary leadership, that sets the stage for what comes next, when the calm before the storm transforms into decisive action. The story of Ching Shih's ascent truly begins with an event that seems, at first, tragic, but would become the turning point of her life. Her husband, Zhang Yi, though a capable pirate captain, died unexpectedly in 1807. In many societies of the time, the death of a husband would have marked the end of a woman's public role, confining her to widowhood and domestic routines. Yet, for Ching Shih, it opened a door that her earlier observations and quiet preparation had readied her to walk through the Red Flag Fleet. At the time of Zhang Yi's death was already a powerful organization, commanding dozens of ships and thousands of pirates along the South China coast. Its members had grown accustomed to structure, discipline, and rules. Yet leadership had traditionally been Ching Shih faced not only the task of assuming her husband's authority, but the challenge of convincing an entire fleet that a woman could wield power in a world defined by violence, risk, and male egos. The transition required subtlety, strategy, and the application of the lessons she had quietly accumulated in her earlier life. She began by consolidating her legitimacy through alliances. Zhang Yi had been married to her, and that connection alone gave her a degree of authority. More importantly, she demonstrated competence and decisiveness within the fleet. She enforced a strict but fair code of conduct. Every member, from the lowest sailor to the most senior captain, was bound by rules that emphasized order, loyalty, and shared benefits. Theft, disobedience, or insubordination were punished consistently, while loyalty and efficiency were rewarded. This created a sense of security within a group accustomed to chaos. Sailors knew what to expect and could trust the leadership to be predictable. Ching Shih's code was not merely reactive, it was proactive. She introduced regulations covering everything from the division of plunder to the treatment of women and prisoners, and even the organization of daily routines aboard ships. One rule, for example, mandated that no pirate could mistreat a townsperson in areas under fleet control. Another regulated how spoils were to be shared, ensuring fairness and reducing disputes. Though mundane in description, these rules were revolutionary in their effect. They created loyalty without relying solely on fear, and they enabled the fleet to operate more efficiently than any disorganized pirate gang. Her methods extended beyond internal discipline to external relations. Coastal towns often feared pirate raids, yet Ching Shih cultivated a pragmatic approach. Some towns were paid for protection, others were left untouched in return for goods or intelligence. Merchants and officials learned that negotiating with her fleet was safer than resisting it, establishing a predictable pattern that both reduced unnecessary conflict and increased profit. Her strategy relied not on brute force alone, but on the subtle application of power, negotiation, and the understanding of human behavior skills, honed in her early years of mundane labor and careful observation. Managing the fleet also required logistical expertise. Hundreds of ships and thousands of men required coordination, supply management, and communication across vast stretches of coastline. Ching Shih established an efficient chain of command, with captains reporting through designated lieutenants, who in turn reported to her. She delegated authority, but maintained oversight, ensuring that decisions were consistent with her strategy. Daily life aboard the ships, once chaotic and prone to conflict, became highly organized. Food rations were measured and distributed. Ships were maintained on strict schedules. Sailors' disputes were resolved swiftly and predictably. What may seem like boring administrative detail was, in practice, the backbone of a powerful empire. Her ability to inspire loyalty was equally remarkable. Many pirate leaders relied on fear alone to maintain control. Ching Shih relied on respect and consistency. Stories from the time suggest that crew members feared disobedience, but respected her decisiveness and fairness even more. She demonstrated a unique combination of empathy and authority. She understood the needs and fears of her sailors, yet she enforced her rules without compromise. Sailors knew that Ching Shih would reward ingenuity, loyalty, and courage, and punish betrayal. But they also knew that the punishments were predictable and impartial. In a world where chance and violence often ruled, this consistency was invaluable. The fleet under her command grew rapidly. Some captains who had once been rivals recognized her authority, while smaller pirate groups voluntarily merged with her forces. She employed strategic diplomacy to avoid unnecessary conflicts, focusing her energy on strengthening her fleet rather than engaging in endless battles. Even when confronted by the Qing Navy or rival pirate bands, she used intelligence and coordination rather than sheer force. Her strategies included deception, careful positioning of ships, and coordinated attacks that minimized risk while maximizing gain. Yet, despite her growing power, the challenges remained constant. Whether disease and occasional mutinies threatened stability, Ching Shih responded with meticulous attention to detail. She personally oversaw supply chains, ensured that ships were repaired promptly, and maintained morale among the fleet. Her ability to handle these ordinary yet essential tasks was central to her success. Each ration of food, each repaired rope, each carefully mediated dispute contributed to the survival and cohesion of her forces. By the time her authority was firmly established, Ching Shih had transformed the Red Flag fleet from a collection of independent pirate crews into a cohesive, disciplined maritime empire. Hundreds of ships operated under a single code. Thousands of men obeyed a single authority, and coastal communities learned to interact with her forces predictably. What had begun as a modest life, defined by domestic labor and observation, had become an extraordinary reign that challenged centuries of social and military norms. And yet, even as she reached the height of her power, questions remained unanswered. How would Ching Shih maintain this empire in the long term, especially when confronted by the growing power of the Qing Navy and the inevitability of political negotiation? Could a pirate queen, no matter how capable, secure a lasting legacy? Without compromise, this tension, the uncertainty of survival, and the challenge of sustaining authority sets the stage for the final section of her story. By the early 19th century, Ching Shih had transformed the South China Sea. Once a collection of independent pirate crews, the Red Flag fleet under her leadership had become a cohesive, disciplined maritime empire. Hundreds of ships sailed in formation, thousands of men obeyed a structured code, and coastal towns learned the predictable patterns of her fleet's operations. She was no longer merely the widow of a pirate captain. She was a sovereign figure in a world dominated by men, whose authority extended across miles of open water and into the hearts of those who depended on or feared her. Her rules, initially introduced to consolidate power, became the framework for an orderly pirate society. No violence against civilians, fair distribution of spoils, clear chains of command, and strict discipline were hallmarks of her code. These seemingly mundane measures, rationing food properly, repairing sails on time, maintaining records of each ship and sailor, were the invisible machinery of her empire. They allowed hundreds of ships to operate as one entity, executing coordinated raids or evading imperial navies with a precision that would have seemed unimaginable to outsiders. Ching Shih's leadership extended beyond logistics and discipline. It relied on an intricate understanding of human behavior. She rewarded loyalty and ingenuity, punished betrayal and recklessness, and maintained a balance between fear and respect. Anecdotes from her life highlight her ability to resolve disputes and negotiate alliances, even among former rivals. Her reputation for fairness became a tool of governance. Sailors and captains followed her orders not solely because they had to, but because they trusted her judgment and understood the consistency of her rules. Externally, she demonstrated strategic genius in dealing with both adversaries and potential allies. The Qing dynasty, intent on suppressing piracy, initially underestimated her ability to unite the fleet. Ching Shih, however, leveraged both military tactics and diplomacy to safeguard her empire. She occasionally negotiated with the Qing authorities, offering terms that ensured the safety of her men while securing her own freedom. These negotiations were delicate, requiring patience, foresight, and a careful reading of political current skills she had honed during years of managing both mundane and critical operations. Aboard her ship's dot, despite her fearsome reputation, Ching Shih ultimately chose a path few pirate leaders could imagine: retirement with her empire intact. In 1810, after years of dominance at sea, she accepted an amnesty from the Qing government, a rare concession granted to her and her associates. She retired peacefully, securing pensions for her crew, and even marrying a former subordinate who had served loyally under her command. While many pirates met violent ends or died at sea, Ching Shih walked away with her life, her influence, and her wealth intact, a remarkable feat in any era, let alone one defined by the perilous life of piracy. Her legacy endured in subtle yet significant ways. The red flag fleets, operational model structured codes, distributed authority, and strategic alliances remained a blueprint for disciplined maritime operations. More importantly, Ching Shih challenged societal norms, demonstrating that leadership and strategic acumen were not the exclusive domains of men. She became a figure remembered not for reckless violence, but for the careful, often invisible work that allowed an entire fleet to function as an organized society. Even in retirement, she continued to influence those around her, quietly advising former crew members and ensuring that her rules persisted. Her life illustrates how ordinary skills, organization, observation, negotiation, patience scale to extraordinary impact when applied consistently and wisely. The seemingly mundane routines of her early life, the repetitive labor aboard ships, and the careful resolution of minor disputes all contributed to the creation of a maritime empire that endured under her guidance. As you reflect on Ching Shih's story, consider the paradox it presents: a life that began in quiet, laborious routines and domestic chores led to dominance over the South China Sea. A woman in a male-dominated world commanded respect, loyalty, and fear, not through flamboyance or cruelty alone, but through meticulous planning, fair administration, and understanding of human behavior. Her story challenges assumptions about power, gender, and the mechanisms that sustain authority. And yet, even with her retirement and the formal dissolution of her pirate career, one cannot help but wonder how many other capable leaders, hidden in mundane routines and overlooked roles, might shape history in ways we rarely notice. Ching Shih's life suggests that greatness often begins quietly, in the repetition of small acts, the careful management of details, and the patient observation of the world around USA. Lesson as relevant today as it was over 2 centuries ago. Her empire may have ended, but the principles she embodied, discipline, fairness, strategic foresight, and resilience, continue to resonate, quietly influencing how we understand leadership, organization, and the hidden currents of human behavior. Imagine walking the narrow, crowded streets of London in the 1660s, a city of roughly 350,000 people, crammed between the River Thames and ancient stone walls. Life here was defined not by grand events, but by daily routines, rising with the sun, working at a craft or trade, and surviving amidst the city's hazards. The streets were a labyrinth of timber-framed houses, their upper stories jutting precariously over the cobblestones below. Smoke from hearth fires mingled with the smell of livestock, open sewers, and damp stone, creating an atmosphere both familiar and oppressive for the average Londoner. Survival was a meticulous balance of labor, caution, and social awareness. Shopkeepers opened stalls at sunrise, sweeping away dirt and ashes left by the previous night's fires from hearths and chimneys. Blacksmiths labored in their forges, the sound of hammer on iron echoing through alleys lined with tightly packed homes. Children ran errands or assisted family trades, often weaving between carts, livestock, and pedestrians. Markets were alive with the hum of bargaining voices, the clatter of wooden wheels, and the occasional shout warning of spilled goods or approaching guards. Houses themselves were a source of constant attention. Timber-framed buildings with thatched roofs were susceptible to fire, rot, and decay. Families spent hours maintaining their homes, patching roofs, replacing timbers, and keeping hearths in check. Even routine cooking was hazardous. Open flames and hot ashes could easily ignite the flammable streetscape. In this way, the mundane labor of daily maintenance was directly tied to survival. Every repaired roof, swept floor, and stoked fire reduced the risk of catastrophe. Food acquisition was another daily concern. Londoners relied on nearby markets, river deliveries, and small gardens where possible. Fish, bread, and vegetables were staples, but spoilage was common, requiring careful planning and rationing. Baking bread was a communal activity for many families, as ovens were expensive and shared among neighbors. These small, repetitive tasks, the kneading of dough, the fetching of water, the tending of fires, were the rhythms of life that sustained a city teetering on the edge of constant hazard. Health and sanitation were equally precarious. Cholera and plague were distant but recurring threats, while minor injuries could become fatal due to infection. People developed routines to minimize risk, careful handling of knives and tools, washing hands in rivers or basins, and avoiding contaminated water. These routines, while monotonous, were vital to survival and shaped the behavior of generations of Londoners. Amid these routines, social hierarchy and neighborhood networks played an important role. Citizens depended on one another for information, safety, and trade. Apprentices learned trades under masters who maintained strict discipline. Neighbors exchanged news of accidents, sickness, or theft. Local constables patrolled the streets, enforcing order as best they could. In such a dense urban environment, ordinary people developed intricate systems of observation, communication, and self-preservation. Yet, Despite all this careful labor, the city remained inherently vulnerable. Timber houses, narrow streets, and open flames created a combustible environment, and no amount of sweeping, patching, or rationing could eliminate the constant risk of fire. It was a world where danger coexisted with routine, where the ordinary cooking, lighting lamps, stacking fire would carry the potential for disaster. Within this precarious setting lived countless individuals whose names history rarely remembers. One such man, an ordinary baker with a modest shop near Pudding Lane, would later survive the catastrophe that transformed London forever. He rose each day, swept the floors of his shop, kneaded dough, and sold bread to neighbors and travelers, never imagining that the very streets and buildings he maintained would soon ignite in a blaze of unimaginable scale. Life in London before the fire was defined by repetition and vigilance. Families followed fixed patterns, waking, working, eating, cleaning, and sleeping. Every mundane tasks, stoking the oven, mending the roof, negotiating a price for fish, was a tiny bulwark against the unpredictable hazards of urban life. It is in these routines, rather than in dramatic events, that the story of survival begins, highlighting the resilience, foresight, and quiet courage of ordinary people. And yet, even as Londoners went about these familiar routines, a question lingered unnoticed. How would they respond when disaster struck? When the fire came, sweeping through timber and thatch with terrifying speed, would the routines of daily life be enough to save them? Or would the ordinary strategies of survival prove insufficient against a force that did not follow the predictable rhythms of human labor? This question, the uncertainty of survival in a city built on timber and tradition, sets the stage for the next chapter, where ordinary routines collide with extraordinary disaster. September 2nd, 1666, began like any other day in London. Citizens woke to the familiar smells of wood smoke from hearths, freshly baked bread, and the damp odor of the River Thames. Yet, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, an ordinary fire had begun in the early hours, one that would escalate into the most devastating urban disaster the city had experienced in decades. What began as routines, stoking a fire, kneading dough, and baking breads, soon transformed into chaos beyond imagination. Timber houses, tightly packed along narrow streets, were the perfect fuel for disaster. Each building leaned against its neighbor, upper floors jutting outward in a precarious imbalance, with thatched roofs that caught sparks instantly. The wind that day blew sharply from the east, carrying flames and embers across the city. Ordinary routines, opening windows, fetching water, sweeping streets, became insufficient against the fire's relentless speed. People reacted with a mixture of panic and adherence to learned survival skills. Families grabbed valuables, extinguished minor fires, and attempted to control flames with buckets of water. Neighbors formed chains to pass buckets from the river to the hearths, a method repeated countless times in cities around the world when fires struck. These routines, simple yet vital, illustrate how ordinary preparation can delay disaster, even if it cannot prevent it entirely. Amid the chaos, communication became critical. Town criers, bell towers, and shouted warnings attempted to alert citizens, but the dense smoke and roar of the flames rendered messages difficult to hear. Families separated, Merchants abandoned stalls, and livestock panicked in narrow alleys. The ordinary networks of neighborhood assistance were overwhelmed. Still, many relied on memory, observation, and basic survival tactics learned over years, staying low to avoid smoke inhalation, moving in groups to avoid getting lost, and constantly monitoring wind direction to anticipate the fire's path. The baker from Pudding Lane, whose ordinary life had involved the repetitive tasks of kneading, baking, and cleaning, now applied the same skills under extreme duress. Quick thinking, calm observation, and attention to detail skills honed in mundane labor became essential. He coordinated the removal of barrels of flour, knowing that the explosion of even a few could worsen the fire. He guided neighbors toward the river, avoiding collapsing buildings, and used small tools and ropes to navigate debris-strewn streets. His survival, like that of countless others, depended not on heroics, but on practical, ordinary decisions repeated under extraordinary pressure. As the fire advanced, it exposed both vulnerabilities and resilience in the city. Narrow streets that facilitated commerce also funneled flames. Tightly clustered buildings increased destruction, but allowed families to warn one another quickly. Citizens relied on predictable patterns, the location of wells, the behavior of embers in wind, the pathways to bridges and open spaces. What seems mundane knowledge of street layouts, water access, and roof construction became critical to escaping certain death. For 3 days, flames swept through London. The fire consumed more than 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and numerous civic buildings. Smoke darkened the sky, ash rained down, and the roar of collapsing timbers echoed across the city. People fled with belongings carried in baskets, bundles, or on carts. Animals were abandoned, though some were saved through coordination. The repetitive knowledge embedded in ordinary labor lifting, carrying, balancing, and navigating was applied in ways that directly saved lives among the survivors. Many noted that calmness, observation, and adherence to routine event altered forms were decisive. Families who had rehearsed basic evacuation procedures or who had carefully stored tools and supplies fared better. Citizens recognized the utility of previously boring tasks. Clean streets made movement easier. Water buckets were accessible due to disciplined storage, and knowledge of one's home layout allowed efficient escape. The extraordinary destruction revealed the hidden power of ordinary preparation. Yet, for every life saved, the fire left uncertainty. Homes were lost, businesses destroyed, and the city's social fabric strained. Even those who escaped faced displacement, hunger, and disease in the aftermath. The disaster highlighted the fragility of urban life in a city built on timber, tradition, and human routines. Survival depended not only on courage or chance, but on accumulated knowledge, small skills, and disciplined action learned in daily life. In observing the fire, historians and citizens alike noted the paradoxical lessons it offered. The very structures and routines that had sustained daily life-tight streets, timber houses, organized marketplaces, both enabled survival and exacerbated destruction. Ordinary skills were applied under extraordinary stress, and the routines of daily existence became strategies for life. Amid chaos, by the time the fire was finally extinguished on September 5th, London was irrevocably changed. Thousands were homeless, scores dead, and the familiar urban landscape reduced to ash. Yet, amid the ruins, stories of ordinary people surviving through repeated, practical decisions emerged. The baker from Pudding Lane and countless others exemplified resilience grounded not in heroism alone, but in the quiet, disciplined knowledge accumulated through years of ordinary life. And yet, even after the flames were extinguished, a question remained. How would Londoners rebuild, and what lessons would endure from a disaster that exposed the fragility of daily routines, the hazards of urban planning, and the power of practical, repetitive labor? This question prepares the stage for the final section of the story, where rebuilding, adaptation, and reflection reveal the subtle endurance of human resilience. The fire had finally been extinguished on September 5, 1666, leaving behind a city that was barely recognizable. Streets once bustling with merchants and craftsmen were now lines of smoldering rubble. Homes, churches, and workshops, Saul carefully maintained over decades, had been reduced to ash. Yet, amid this devastation, the resilience of Londoners became evident. Survival alone was not enough. The challenge now was reconstruction, restoring the rhythms of daily life that had previously been taken for granted. Rebuilding London required organization, cooperation, and persistence. Families returned to damaged neighborhoods, salvaging whatever they could from the ruins: pots, tools, furniture, and personal belongings. Each household developed improvised routines to cope with temporary shelters, shared kitchens, and scarce resources. The meticulous habits ingrained during ordinary life, inventorying supplies, rationing food, repairing possessions, became the foundation of survival. The repetition of mundane tasks, so often overlooked in daily existence, now took on extraordinary importance. Government and civic authorities faced enormous challenges. Fire prevention became a priority, prompting the introduction of new regulations on building materials, street widths, and fire control measures. Timber-framed houses with thatched roofs were replaced with brick and stone, streets were widened, and fire breaks were introduced. Even these technical measures, which may seem dull in description, represented a profound shift in urban planning. Cities now understood that ordinary precautions, maintained consistently, could prevent future catastrophe. For ordinary citizens, reconstruction was labor-intensive and often exhausting. Men and women hauled bricks, mixed mortar, and rebuilt walls. Families coordinated repairs to multiple buildings simultaneously, pooling labor to restore homes and businesses. Daily routines were adapted to a post-fire environment. Bread baking occurred in temporary ovens. Markets were improvised in open spaces, and water from the Thames or makeshift wells was rationed carefully. Each action was a repetition of basic survival tasks under altered conditions, demonstrating the resilience of human habits in the face of disruption. The psychological impact of the fire was also significant. Survivors had witnessed destruction on a massive scale, losing neighbors, friends, and family. Yet stories of survival, like that of the baker from Pudding Lane, spread throughout the city, offering models for practical action and hope. People realized that ordinary attentiveness, knowledge of one's environment, careful handling of possessions, and organized daily labor could reduce risk and increase resilience. This insight quietly absorbed and applied, shaped the social fabric of post-fire London. Trade and commerce slowly resumed. Merchants established temporary stalls, craftsmen repaired tools and equipment, and markets regained their rhythms. Each small act, the careful measurement of flour, the rebuilding of a stall, the repair of a roof, was both routine and revolutionary. It restored the city's capacity to function, proving that ordinary labor is the backbone of societal continuity. The repetitive, often boring work of daily life, when disrupted, revealed its true significance. The rebuilding process also highlighted the importance of community networks. Neighbors collaborated to clear rubble, shared resources, and coordinated labor for mutual benefit. Apprentices learned trades in new workshops, passing on skills essential to survival and economic recovery. The social cohesion that had been nurtured in everyday routines became a tool for overcoming extraordinary disruption. Even informal rules agreements about who would help whom, how to share water and firewood, and how to prioritize repairs mirrored the ordinary codes that had structured life before the fire. Over time, London emerged not only physically reconstructed, but also fundamentally transformed. Fire safety regulations, improved construction materials, and urban planning were direct outcomes of the disaster. Yet perhaps the most lasting legacy was intangible, an appreciation for the quiet skills, habits, and disciplines of daily life. The repetition of ordinary actions, cooking, cleaning, repairing, coordinating, proved essential to survival, and citizens understood in new ways how routine contributes to resilience. As you reflect on the survivors of the Great Fire, it becomes clear that heroism was not only in dramatic escapes or daring rescues, but also in mundane perseverance. The ordinary baker, families clearing rubble, craftsmen rebuilding homes, and neighbors coordinating resources all exemplified human adaptability grounded in routine. Their collective labor restored a city and provided lessons for future generations. Preparation, observation, and consistency in daily life are subtle yet powerful tools for enduring catastrophe. And yet, even as the city rebuilt, one might wonder, how many lessons from disaster go unnoticed, buried in the details of ordinary life, until a crisis reveals their importance? How many other cities, families, and individuals survive and adapt quietly, unnoticed by history, thanks to the invisible rhythms of routine, patience, and careful attention? This reflection on the hidden significance of ordinary life offers a profound insight. Resilience is often cultivated in the monotony of daily labor, long before disaster ever strikes. Imagine entering a medieval monastery in the 12th century, a secluded world separated from the bustling towns and villages that surround it. The monastery is a self-contained community, governed not by wealth, ambition, or politics, but by rhythm, routine, and devotion. Here, life is defined by the passage of hours, measured not by clocks, which are scarce, but by the sequence of prayers, labor, and study. Every task, from sweeping the cloister to tending a vegetable garden, carries both practical and spiritual significance. The day begins before sunrise, often around 4 a.m., with the first prayer, matins. Monks rise quietly, careful not to disturb others, and dress in simple habits made of coarse wool. Silence dominates these early hours. Conversation is minimal, limited to essential communication. The act of rising and dressing itself is deliberate and methodical, reinforcing discipline and preparing the mind for the spiritual tasks ahead. Even these mundane movements, fastening robes, washing hands, tying cords, are performed with attention, becoming part of a larger practice of mindfulness. Following matins, monks proceed to lauds, another early morning prayer. These ritualized prayers structure the day, providing both spiritual guidance and a fixed schedule around which all other activities revolve. While it might seem monotonous to the outsider, for the monk, these repetitions cultivate focus, patience, and a steady rhythm of life. The repetition of words, gestures, and songs is not merely ceremonial. It is intended to internalize discipline, reinforcing values that guide thought and behavior throughout the day. Breakfast is modest, usually bread, cheese, and water, or weak ale. Meals are consumed in silence or with readings from sacred texts, ensuring that even nourishment is accompanied by reflection. Monks observe strict dietary rules, often fasting on designated days, which imposes a regimen of self-control. Every aspect of sustenance, from preparation to consumption, is regulated, reducing indulgence and promoting mindfulness. This structured approach to food reinforces the broader rhythm of monastic life. Every action, no matter how ordinary, contributes to spiritual and communal order. After breakfast, labor begins. Monks are assigned tasks that may include tending gardens, repairing buildings, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or milling grain. Each job, no matter how mundane, is approached with diligence and care. In the scriptorium, scribes labor over texts for hours, copying letters carefully and illuminating manuscripts with painstaking precision. The repetition of writing, the meticulous attention to detail, and the slow pace of work foster both skill and focus. These tasks, while seemingly dull, are essential for the survival of the monastery and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Outside the scriptorium, other monks maintain the monastery's physical infrastructure. Cloisters are swept, courtyards cleared of debris, and stone pathways repaired. Kitchens, stables, and barns demand constant attention, and tasks are divided to ensure that the community functions smoothly. Even these repetitive chores are imbued with purpose. Each swept floor, each repaired wall, each tended garden contributes to the order and stability of the community. Monks understand that neglecting these small duties could disrupt both spiritual practice and daily survival. Prayer punctuates work at regular intervals, reinforcing the rhythm of the day. The canonical Hoursters, Sext, None, Vespers, and Complinant Irvine at set times, reminding monks that labor and devotion are inseparable. A monk pruning vines pauses to reflect on the divine. A scribe, lifting his quill, stops to meditate briefly on the words being copied. Even the most repetitive or boring tasks are transformed into acts of contemplation, illustrating how routine labor can serve higher purposes beyond its immediate practical value. Life in the monastery also involves strict social rules. Silence is observed in designated areas, and speech is limited to practical matters. Meals and work are communal but structured. Each person knows their place, their duties, and the expected behavior. Discipline is enforced not only by abbots, but by the shared understanding that order sustains life and devotion. Conflict is minimized through hierarchy, mutual respect, and the predictable repetition of tasks and routines. Health and survival are quietly managed. Monks tend gardens to ensure a steady supply of vegetables and herbs. Brew ale that is safer to drink than potentially contaminated water, and maintain clean living spaces. Even minor attention to details, sweeping floors, cleaning utensils, monitoring stored food, directly affects the community's well-being. Life is fragile in the medieval world, and the routines that outsiders might call boring are, in practice, lifelines as the day progresses. Work continues alongside prayer, study, and communal meals. Tasks are rotated, ensuring that no one is idle and all contributions are meaningful. The rhythm of life, rising, praying, laboring, eating, reflecting, creates a sense of stability and predictability in an otherwise uncertain world. Monks internalize these patterns, finding comfort and purpose in repetition. Their lives, though ordinary in outward appearance, are structured to sustain both physical survival and spiritual growth. Yet, despite the monotony, questions linger. How did these daily routines shape not only individual lives, but broader cultural and intellectual history? How did the seemingly insignificant work of copying manuscripts, tending gardens, and maintaining buildings contribute to the survival of knowledge, tradition, and community in an era of disease, famine, and political upheaval? These questions hint at a deeper understanding that the quiet, repetitive labor of ordinary life can leave lasting impacts far beyond its apparent mundanity. While life in the monastery appears calm and ordered from the outside, it was not without challenges, discomforts, and hidden dangers. The very seclusion that provided spiritual focus also made the community vulnerable to illness, scarcity, and internal tension. Monks faced a delicate balance, maintaining discipline and routine while navigating the unpredictable realities of medieval life. Disease was a constant, though often invisible, threat. Medieval hygiene, even within a monastery, was limited by contemporary knowledge. Water for washing was drawn from wells or nearby streams, often shared among residents, increasing the risk of contamination. Illnesses such as dysentery, fevers, and respiratory infections could spread quickly in the confined living spaces of the dormitory, refectory, and scriptorium. Monks learned to mitigate these risks through careful cleaning, strict rules for personal hygiene, and the regulation of shared spaces, mundane measures that quietly preserved life. Nutrition to posed challenges. Monks largely relied on vegetables, legumes, grains, and occasionally fish or dairy. Meat was rare, often restricted by religious observances. Food preservation required careful planning. Drying, salting, and fermenting were essential for sustaining the community through seasons. When fresh produce was scarce, daily routines, preparing meals, monitoring stores, and rotating supplies became a lifeline. Missing a step in these repetitive tasks could result in spoiled food, hunger, or disease. The discipline of routine, seemingly boring to an outsider, was essential for survival. Weather and climate added further complications. Monasteries were often cold, damp places with thick stone walls that insulated poorly against winter chill. Drafts, condensation, and limited heating made prolonged prayer or work physically uncomfortable. Monks adapted through layered clothing, careful maintenance of fires, and disciplined physical activity. Even the repetition of seemingly menial tasks like chopping wood, carrying water, or sweeping floors helped maintain warmth and circulation. Survival depended on consistent, methodical labor, repeated daily with little variation. The human element, the dynamics within the community, was another area of subtle challenge. Monks lived in close quarters, under strict rules, with minimal private space. Tensions could arise from personality clashes, mistakes, or perceived slights. Discipline was maintained through a combination of hierarchy, shared values, and predictable routines. Mistakes in chores, lateness to prayers, or breaches of silence could result in reprimand or penance. Such measures may seem minor or tedious, but they preserved harmony in a society where conflict could disrupt both work and spiritual practice. Education and intellectual labor introduced additional pressures. In the scriptorium, the copying of manuscripts was not merely repetitive. It required intense focus, precision, and endurance. Errors could ruin pages, wasting valuable parchment and ink. Illuminators, working with pigments and delicate brushes, spent hours on intricate designs. These tasks demanded patience and steadiness, and yet they were often invisible to outsiders. The mundane, painstaking labor of transcription preserved knowledge through centuries, allowing literature, theology, and scientific ideas to survive. Periods of political upheaval and social instability, religious devotion intertwined with every activity, reinforcing discipline but also imposing its own demands. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline interrupted work and meals, requiring monks to stop physical labor and redirect focus entirely to prayer. Missing or rushing these obligations was not simply a spiritual lapse, but a disruption of communal order. Life in the monastery depended on adherence to this structure and the repetition of prayers, anchored both body and mind in predictable rhythms. Isolation from the outside world created further challenges. Monks had limited contact with townspeople, markets, and the broader political landscape. Supplies had to be managed carefully, and external threats, raiders, famine, or disease outbreaks required preparedness and foresight. The quiet vigilance embedded in routine activities, from repairing doors to monitoring food stores, acted as an early warning system against potential crises. Repetition and attention to detail were as much survival strategies as acts of devotion. Yet, within this disciplined, ordered life, there was room for subtle creativity and personal growth. Scribes developed skill and artistry. Gardeners experimented with planting patterns. Cooks mastered preparation and preservation. The repetition of ordinary tasks allowed mastery to emerge, turning routine labor into a quiet form of expertise. Monks learned that resilience, patience, and steady observation could yield rewards far beyond immediate survival. Despite the monotony and hidden dangers, the monastery functioned as a living organism. Each member contributed to the collective well-being, relying on others to fulfill roles with consistency and care. Daily routines, mundane, boring, repetitive, became the invisible scaffolding that held the community together. The lives of monks demonstrate that ordinary, disciplined labor, when repeated across years, can produce extraordinary outcomes. preservation of knowledge, continuity of community, and the survival of a society through uncertainty. And yet, even within the walls of the monastery, questions remained. How much of human resilience depends on strict structure versus individual ingenuity? How did these quiet, repetitive acts of labor ripple outward, influencing culture, education, and even politics beyond the cloistered walls? These questions set the stage for the final section, where reflection on legacy and the endurance of monastic routines reveals the unseen power of ordinary life. As centuries passed, the quiet rhythms of monastic life left an impact far beyond the monastery walls. While monks themselves often sought seclusion, the structures, routines, and knowledge they maintained subtly shaped society, culture, and education across medieval Europe. Their work, painstaking and repetitive, demonstrates that even the most ordinary seeming routines can have extraordinary consequences over time. The first and most visible legacy was in the preservation of knowledge. Scribes in monasteries copied countless manuscripts, including religious texts, historical records, scientific treatises, and classical literature. Each page was produced with meticulous care, often taking days or weeks for a single volume. While it may appear dull letter after letter, line after line, their labor ensured that ideas, stories, and practical knowledge survived eras of war, famine, and political turmoil. Later generations of scholars relied on these manuscripts as foundations for learning, discovery, and cultural continuity. Without the repetition and patience of ordinary monastic work, vast swaths of classical and medieval knowledge might have been lost. Monastic gardens and agricultural practices also left a lasting mark. Monks cultivated herbs, vegetables, and fruit with care, experimenting with planting techniques and seasonal rotations. They kept detailed records of yields, weather patterns, and cultivation methods. These practices informed broader agricultural knowledge, influencing farming techniques beyond monastic lands. Ordinary, repetitive tasks such as planting, watering, and weeding were quietly transformative, creating an accumulation of practical expertise that outlived the monastic communities themselves. Beyond knowledge and agriculture, monasteries served as centers of social stability. In times of famine, plague, or unrest, they provided shelter, food, and medical care to local populations. Monks applied the same discipline and organization they used for internal survival to support their neighbors. Simple routines, preparing meals, distributing aid, maintaining records of provisions became instruments of resilience for entire communities. Ordinary labor, repeated consistently, had tangible impacts on human lives beyond the cloister walls. Education was another area where the monastery's influence endured. Novices trained under strict schedules, learning not only religious doctrine but also literacy, arithmetic, and practical skills. The repetitive nature of study, copying texts, and participating in structured tasks honed discipline, patience, and intellectual rigor. These young monks often left monasteries to serve in other capacities: teachers, scribes, administrators, or advisors, spreading the habits of careful work and structured thinking into broader society. The invisible scaffolding of routine supported the development of human capital, often unnoticed in the historical record. Even architecture reflects the legacy of monastic life. The design of monasteries, refectories, dormitories, gardens, and workshops was carefully planned to optimize movement, productivity, and spiritual focus. These layouts influenced later urban and civic planning, demonstrating how disciplined, repetitive attention to detail can generate enduring structural and functional knowledge. What may have seemed like mundane arrangements of halls and courtyards ultimately informed building practices for generations. The spiritual influence of monastic routine cannot be overstated. The repetition of prayer, meditation, and disciplined labor instilled values of patience, attentiveness, and humility. While these virtues were cultivated in a religious context, they had practical applications as well in administration, education, trade, and interpersonal relations. The habits learned in monasteries reinforced stability, order, and foresight. Ordinary tasks, sweeping floors, tending candles, or copying texts became exercises in mindfulness and resilience, shaping character and behavior in subtle yet profound ways. Looking back, the life of a medieval monk illustrates a striking truth. Greatness often lies in repetition, consistency, and attention to detail. While battles, kings, and revolutions dominate history books, it is the quiet labor of ordinary routines that preserves knowledge, sustains communities, and shapes the future. Monks demonstrate that the invisible threads of discipline, patience, and care weave a legacy far more enduring than any single dramatic event. And yet, even as we admire these legacies, one cannot help but reflect how much of modern society relies on invisible, repetitive labor that goes unnoticed. How many structures, systems, and bodies of knowledge survive today only because of the diligence and patience of those who performed boring tasks long ago. The monasteries remind us that history is not solely forged in moments of drama, but often in the meticulous, persistent acts of ordinary life, quietly shaping the world for generations to come. Imagine stepping into a small workshop in Victorian England. Somewhere in the mid-1800s, the space is cluttered with brass gears, glass vials, scraps of metal, and sketches tacked to the walls. Lamps burn steadily, casting warm circles of light on benches and tables. Outside, the streets of the industrial city hum with the sounds of factories, horses, and the occasional steam whistle. But inside the workshop, the world is quieter, ruled by the steady rhythm of work, observation, and experimentation. The inventor, often unremarkable in appearance, man or woman in plain clothing, hands calloused from constant labor, follows a strict routine. Each morning begins with organizing materials, checking the condition of tools, sharpening files, polishing lenses, and arranging spare parts. These mundane preparations might seem insignificant, yet they form the foundation for creativity and experimentation. Without order and predictability, innovation could not proceed efficiently. Small mistakes or missing components could derail hours or even weeks of work. Once preparations are complete, the inventor begins experiments. These are often repetitive, tedious, and sometimes frustrating. Testing a mechanical gear, adjusting a spring, or refining a chemical formula involves countless iterations, each slightly different from the last. A single experiment may last hours, yet only minor variations distinguish success from failure. Patience, precision and attention to detail are paramount. Each adjustment, no matter how small, accumulates knowledge, forming a mental record of what works and what does not. Observation is constant. The inventor notes every nuance, the way a pendulum swings, the pattern of sparks in a small engine, the subtle shifts in pressure or temperature. Sketches are made repeatedly, measurements recorded in notebooks, calculations double-checked, and theories refined. These repetitive tasks, while monotonous to an outsider, constitute the invisible labor of discovery. Innovations often emerge, not in sudden bursts of inspiration, but through steady, methodical observation repeated over days, weeks, and months. Meals and breaks are simple and functional. Bread, cheese, tea, and occasionally meat or stew provide sustenance, often eaten alone or quickly between experiments. Mealtime is brief and quiet, allowing the inventor to return to work without losing momentum. Even these ordinary axe-cutting, bread, stirring tea, cleaning utensils are part of a disciplined routine that maintains energy and focus. In this environment, efficiency is essential. Time spent idle is time lost in the pursuit of invention. The workshop itself is an ecosystem of quiet labor. Tools are arranged methodically. Benches are swept and maintained. Chemical reagents labeled and stored. Materials inventoried with care. Each corner holds a record of past experiments, a reminder that even failures are valuable. A burned-out wire, a broken gear, or a spilled solution becomes a lesson, logged meticulously in the inventor's notes. The repetition of observation, adjustment, and record-keeping is what transforms failure into incremental progress. Visitors are rare, and social life is limited. Correspondence with other inventors or patrons may occur, but much of the work is solitary. This isolation, while challenging, allows focus and encourages deep engagement with problems that may take months or years to solve. Mental discipline is cultivated through repetition, the same experiments performed again and again, the same measurements recalculated, the same observations scrutinized. In this monotony, expertise and intuition quietly develop. The broader world of innovation, however, looms in the background. Factories churn out products, cities grow, and technological progress accelerates. Yet many inventors remain forgotten, their contributions minor in the grand narrative, though essential in cumulative terms. Their work small refinements too. Engines, subtle improvements to machines, adjustments to chemical processes lays the groundwork for larger discoveries. The repetitive, meticulous labor behind invention is rarely celebrated. But without it, progress would stall. Even in failure, lessons are learned. Experiments may not produce immediate results, but they teach resilience, adaptability, and problem-solving. The mental discipline of repetition, the careful logging of observations, and the steady correction of errors form habits that endure across projects. These ordinary routines, often unnoticed by history, build the invisible scaffolding of innovation. And yet, one wonders how many ideas have been lost because the ordinary labor of refinement was undervalued. How many small, repetitive adjustments quietly shaped technological progress, while the inventors themselves faded into obscurity. The story of the 19th century workshop invites reflection on the hidden work behind visible progress, the patient, repetitive labor that turns curiosity into invention, and the ordinary routines that underpin extraordinary outcomes. Life in a 19th century workshop was rarely glamorous. Outside, the world celebrated inventors who produced revolutionary machines or patented life-changing devices. Inside, the reality was a grind of repetition, failure, and incremental progress. For every apparent success, there were countless hours spent on experiments that yielded nothing. Lessons learned only in disappointment. Yet these setbacks were not wasted. They formed the backbone of understanding, revealing the limits of materials, mechanics, and human ingenuity. The first challenge was resources. Raw materials, metals, glass, chemicals, or fabrics were expensive and often difficult to acquire. The inventor needed careful planning to ensure experiments could proceed without interruption. This meant rationing, meticulous inventory, and recycling components whenever possible. A broken spring, a warped lens, or a spilled chemical could halt progress for days or weeks. Patience and foresight were essential, as was the ability to adapt quickly to unexpected shortages. These mundane challenges, often overlooked, shaped the inventor's strategies and problem-solving skills. Technical difficulties were constant. Gears misaligned, engines overheated, electrical connections failed. The inventor's days were punctuated by troubleshooting, adjusting tolerances, recalibrating instruments, or modifying designs to compensate for inconsistencies in materials. Each minor adjustment, while seemingly trivial, represented careful observation and reflection. Breakthroughs rarely arrived in dramatic flashes. Instead, they emerged gradually as a series of small corrections, experiments, and refinements, coalesced into functional improvements. Isolation was another hurdle. Many inventors worked alone, relying on letters or occasional visits from colleagues for feedback. This solitude fostered concentration, but also magnified errors or blind spots. Without an external perspective, mistakes could persist unnoticed, requiring repeated trials to uncover repetition inherent in daily experimentation, rechecking measurements. Repeating trials and verifying results was a safeguard against oversight. It illustrates how persistent, disciplined labor mitigates the risks of isolation in any field of endeavor. Time itself was both ally and adversary. Experiments often spanned weeks, months, or even years. Progress was incremental, almost imperceptible, day by day. The routine of the workshop, measuring, adjusting, recording, may have appeared monotonous, yet it was precisely this repetition that allowed cumulative understanding to develop. Each failure, each adjustment, each repeated measurement contributed to a slow but steady accumulation of knowledge. Breakthroughs, when they occurred, were often subtle. A gear that moved more smoothly, a chemical reaction that stabilized, or a mechanical adjustment that reduced friction might seem minor in isolation. Yet these small successes could lead to practical improvements or lay the groundwork for future innovations. Often, the inventor would not realize the significance of these small discoveries until years later, when they were combined with other innovations in ways that transformed industry, science, or daily life. Mental discipline was critical. In navigating these challenges, frustration, fatigue, and disappointment were constant companions. Maintaining focus required routine, repetition, and meticulous attention to detail. monotonous tasks, polishing components, recalculating measurements, retesting mechanisms as anchors for concentration. In this structured environment, the mind could observe patterns, detect subtle errors, and synthesize incremental improvements. The routine labor that might appear boring to outsiders was, in fact, the engine of discovery. Even setbacks offered unexpected lessons. A failed experiment revealed limitations of materials, flaws in design, or errors in calculation. Recording these failures in notebooks ensured they became part of a growing body of knowledge. Future experiments built on these observations, demonstrating the power of documentation and repetition in advancing understanding. The invisible labor of persistence, attempt, failure, reflection, and retry was as vital to invention as the eureka moments celebrated in history books. Despite these challenges, the workshop remained a place of hope and quiet accomplishment. Each small improvement reinforced the belief that progress was possible, even if slow and tedious. The routines of measuring, adjusting, observing, and recording were not mere chores. They were deliberate practices that shaped skill, fostered resilience, and laid the groundwork for breakthroughs that may never have been attributed to the inventor. And yet, a lingering question persists. How many subtle innovations went unnoticed, lost to history because the labor behind them was invisible? How many ordinary, repetitive tasks quietly shaped the technological landscape, even though the names of those who performed them were forgotten? These questions prepare the stage for Section 3, where we will reflect on the legacy of the inventor and the unseen impact of their persistent, meticulous labor. As the 19th century unfolded, many inventors remained unnamed in history books, their contributions overshadowed by more prominent figures or mass-produced technologies. Yet the quiet, repetitive work of these individuals left indelible marks on society, science, and industry. The forgotten inventor of our story exemplifies how persistent, methodical labor, often invisible to the outside world, can influence progress far beyond immediate recognition. The first legacy of the inventor lies in incremental innovation. While dramatic breakthroughs capture attention, most technological advances emerge from small improvements, adjustments to gears, refinements in chemical processes, or minor optimizations in mechanical designs often accumulate unnoticed. These subtle changes may seem trivial individually, but over time they improve efficiency, reliability, and usability, laying foundations for more visible inventions. The persistence of the inventor in repeating experiments, recording outcomes, and refining techniques created the unseen scaffolding upon which future innovations depended. Documentation played a critical role. Detailed notebooks, sketches, and records of experiments preserved knowledge that could be shared with colleagues or referenced in later projects. Even failed experiments contributed valuable insights, forming a repository of lessons for others. In this way, the laborious repetition of tests, measurements, and observations became a form of intellectual inheritance, extending influence beyond the workshop walls and beyond the inventor's lifetime. The inventor's dedication to precision and discipline also set a standard for craft and professionalism. Mechanical tolerances, chemical purity, and meticulous assembly practices established habits that shaped industrial standards. Craftsmen Apprentices and collaborators absorbed these routines, incorporating them into factories, laboratories, and workshops. The invisible hand of repetitive, careful labor thus shaped entire industries, demonstrating that consistency and attention to detail often drive progress as much as brilliant insights or revolutionary ideas. Socially, the workshop served as a quiet center of learning and experimentation. Apprentices observed methods, techniques, and problem-solving strategies, gaining skills that could be applied in multiple contexts. The daily repetition of labor instilled patience, resilience, and analytical thinking traits that transcended any single project. These intangible lessons, passed on through practice rather than fame, extended the inventor's impact across generations of workers, engineers, and scientists. Even the smallest discoveries, the improved spring, the refined lens, the more efficient chemical mixture, revealed the cumulative power of ordinary labor. While these achievements rarely warranted public recognition, they enhanced efficiency, reliability, and safety in countless applications. The invisible work of methodical experimentation demonstrates that progress often depends less on dramatic inspiration and more on persistent, deliberate effort applied consistently over time. In reflecting on the forgotten inventor, one realizes that history is shaped as much by repetition and persistence as by genius or vision. Countless innovations relied on the labor of individuals whose names were never celebrated. Their lives were marked by early mornings, careful measurements, repeated failures, and modest triumphs. These seemingly boring routines sustained the progress of technology and industry, proving that diligence in ordinary tasks can have extraordinary long-term effects. Moreover, the story invites a deeper reflection. How many other forgotten inventors, workers, and laborers contributed silently to human progress? How many modern conveniences, mechanical, chemical, or technological, rely on a hidden history of disciplined repetition and patient observation? Recognizing the unseen labor that underpins innovation offers a profound understanding of how ordinary human effort, sustained over time, shapes the course of history. Finally, the legacy of the 19th century workshop is not just technological, but philosophical. It teaches that persistence, patience, and attention to detail are as powerful as creativity and inspiration. Ordinary routines, repeated meticulously, create a framework for discovery, mastery, and resilience. The forgotten inventor reminds us that history is not only the story of famous breakthroughs or dramatic events, but also of quiet, disciplined labor performed far from recognition, whose cumulative impact endures for generations. And yet, one is left to ponder. In today's world, how many innovations, systems, and cultural achievements quietly rely on the repeated, uncelebrated labor of countless individuals? How many ordinary routines are building the future, even now, unnoticed, waiting to be acknowledged only by those patient enough to look closely? Imagine stepping onto a merchant ship in the late 18th century, anchored in a foggy port, sails furled, and deck glistening with seawater. The ship itself is a small, self-contained world, carrying cargo, crew, and supplies for weeks or months. At sea, life aboard is structured around rhythm, routine, and survival. Every task, no matter how mundane, serves a purpose, ensuring the ship's operation. safeguarding cargo, and sustaining the crew. The day begins before dawn. Sailors rise to the cold, damp air of the morning, often pulling on damp clothing or waterproof cloaks. The first task is maintenance, cleaning the deck, checking rigging, repairing sails, and inspecting ropes and masts. Every knot tied and rope secured matters. A small error could endanger the ship and crew during a sudden storm. Repetition is essential daily. Inspections prevent larger problems. Over time, the constant handling of ropes, pulleys, and sails develops muscle memory, ensuring that in emergencies, actions are automatic. Breakfast is simple: hardtack, salted meat, and water, or weak ale. Meals are eaten quickly on deck or in cramped mess areas, often in near silence. Eating is functional rather than social, sustaining energy for the day's labor. Afterward, work continues. Tasks are divided according to rank, skill, and experience. Deckhands haul lines. Carpenters maintain the ship's structure. Navigators calculate positions, and lookouts scan the horizon. Each role is specialized, yet all are connected. The smooth functioning of one crew member affects the efficiency and safety of the entire ship. Routine dominates the sailors' lives. Hours are measured by the ringing of bells or the watch system, dividing the crew into shifts. A 4-hour watch may involve steering the ship, monitoring sails, or observing weather patterns. Meals, cleaning, and rest are scheduled around these watches, ensuring constant vigilance. Even sleep is regimented. Hammocks sway with the motion of the ship, but sailors must wake reliably for their next watch. This constant repetition reinforces discipline, focus, and endurance, traits essential to survival in an unpredictable environment. Weather dictates much of daily activity. Storms, high winds, and rough seas demand immediate action, securing cargo, adjusting sails, and steering into the wind. In calmer conditions, tasks include scrubbing decks, painting hulls, repairing nets, or tending to livestock or provisions. These chores may appear dull to outsiders, but they are vital for maintaining the ship's integrity and ensuring the crew's survival. The monotony of routine is a safeguard. Consistent care prevents accidents and loss at sea. Navigation is both precise and repetitive. Observing the sun, stars, or landmarks, measuring angles with a sextant, and recording positions in a logbook requires meticulous attention. Even minor errors can lead to getting lost or running aground. Navigators repeat these measurements day after day, cross-checking with previous data to ensure accuracy. Over time, repetition transforms these observations into skill, allowing sailors to anticipate changes in wind, tide, and currents. Health and hygiene are quiet concerns. Fresh water is rationed, and bathing is rare. Sailors maintain personal cleanliness through regular scrubbing and laundering whenever possible. Food preservation is crucial. Salted meats, dried grains, and hardtack form the bulk of the diet, requiring careful storage and rotation. The repetitive labor of maintaining the ship's stores, cleaning barrels, and monitoring provisions is essential for preventing disease and starvation. Social life is minimal yet structured. Communication occurs mainly through assigned duties, signals, and shared labor. Discipline is maintained by hierarchy and ritual. Orders are given clearly, repeated when necessary, and followed precisely. Even in moments of leisure, such as singing, storytelling, or mending clothes, routines of repetition and focus persist. These ordinary patterns form the backbone of cooperation and survival in a small, isolated community at sea. Yet, even amid the routines, sailors remain alert to the unpredictable. Pirates, storms, or sudden illness can strike without warning. The repetitive labor of daily maintenance, navigation, and watchkeeping quietly prepares the crew for emergencies, reducing risk and ensuring rapid, coordinated responses. What may seem mundane, the daily tightening of a rope, checking a sail, or measuring a course, in fact, critical for life itself. And so, as you imagine life aboard this merchant ship, one begins to appreciate the extraordinary discipline hidden within ordinary routines. Every action is both mundane and vital, a repeated task that safeguards survival and enables the slow, steady progress of trade across the seas. And yet, even as the sailors follow these routines, one might wonder how many moments of quiet diligence have shaped global commerce, exploration, and human connection, unnoticed by history, yet essential to the movement of goods, ideas, and people across the world. Life on a merchant ship was far from easy. While routine and discipline formed the backbone of survival, sailors faced constant challenges: storms, sickness, scarcity, and the unpredictable dangers of the open sea. The quiet, repetitive labor that filled their days was as much a survival strategy as a measure of efficiency. Without it, the ship and crew would not endure. Storms were the most immediate and dramatic threat. The sea could shift from calm to violent in hours, with winds howling, waves smashing against the hull, and rain soaking everything on deck. Sailors had to respond quickly, securing sails, tightening ropes, and adjusting ballast to prevent capsizing. These tasks were physically exhausting and mentally taxing, but repetition and prior training made responses almost automatic. Years of practice meant that even under extreme conditions, muscle memory guided actions, allowing the crew to work as a cohesive unit, often without verbal communication. Yet danger came in quieter forms, too. Disease was a constant companion, magnified by confined spaces, limited hygiene, and long periods away from fresh food and clean water. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was particularly feared, often creeping silently into the crew and weakening sailors long before it was recognized. Daily routines, rationing water, monitoring food, and performing small maintenance tasks like cleaning storage areas or inspecting barrels were vital for minimizing illness. The repetition of these chores quietly safeguarded health, illustrating that even mundane labor could be a lifeline. Fatigue compounded the risk. Watches lasted for hours at a time, often followed by only short periods of rest. Physical exhaustion was constant. Climbing masts, hauling lines, scrubbing decks, and performing repairs demanded endurance. Mental fatigue also played a role. Navigation required constant calculation, observation, and vigilance. Repetition, surprisingly, became an allier. Routines reduced cognitive load, allowing the crew to respond more reliably under stress. Muscle memory and practiced habits became essential tools for survival. Supplies presented another challenge. Water, food, and medical provisions were finite, requiring careful planning and rationing. Sailors monitored storage meticulously, rotating hardtack, salted meats, and other essentials to prevent spoilage. Failure in these routines could result in hunger, malnutrition, or disease. Even seemingly trivial acts checking barrel seals, wiping condensation, or logging consumption were critical for sustaining life over long voyages. Conflict, too, could emerge within the crew. Close quarters, high stress, and long periods of isolation could lead to tension. Hierarchical discipline, watch routines, and shared labor helped manage potential disputes. Rituals such as daily inspections, assigned duties, and strict adherence to orders maintained order and cohesion. Monotony, in this case, became protective. Repetition structured life, creating predictability in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Piracy and theft were additional intermittent dangers. Merchant ships carried valuable cargo, making them tempting targets for privateers or pirates. Preparation for these threats involved careful organization of goods, training in defensive maneuvers, and readiness drills. Even minor repetitive practices such as checking hatches, securing ropes, and rehearsing commands enhanced the crew's preparedness, proving that routine labor could directly protect lives and property. The psychological toll of extended voyages cannot be underestimated. Weeks, sometimes months, passed with little contact with land, family, or news. Sailors relied on routines, meals, chores, watches, and occasional leisure activities like singing, mending clothing, or storytelling to maintain mental stability. Repetition provided structure, comfort, and predictability, helping sailors endure isolation and uncertainty. The mundane rhythmical tasks offered a stabilizing anchor amid the vast, unpredictable ocean. Yet, amid these challenges, small successes offered quiet triumphs. A repaired sail holding through a storm, accurate navigation, avoiding treacherous shoals, or a well-maintained store preventing sickness were all victories that ensured the survival of the crew and the success of the voyage. These achievements, while rarely recorded in history, were profound in their practical impact, illustrating that survival and progress often rely on the unnoticed labor of countless small acts performed consistently over time. And so, even as the crew endured storms, sickness, and scarcity, one begins to see the extraordinary resilience cultivated through repetition and routine. Each knot tied, each watch completed, each barrel inspected was not merely a task, but a vital contribution to life, safety, and the continuation of trade. And yet, one might ask, how many voyages, discoveries, or exchanges of goods relied entirely on these quiet, disciplined routines, performed by sailors whose names were never remembered, but whose labor enabled the flow of the world. Though merchant sailors rarely appear in the history books, their disciplined, repetitive labor shaped the course of global trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. The quiet routines endured through storms, fatigue, and scarcity ensured the survival of ships, cargo, and crew. Their work was the invisible engine that sustained the flow of goods, ideas, and people across oceans, linking continents long before modern technology made travel swift and predictable. One of the most tangible legacies is the facilitation of global commerce. Merchant ships carried spices, textiles, metals, and raw materials, linking distant markets and creating networks that fueled economic growth. Sailors' routines, rigorous maintenance, careful navigation, and meticulous cargo handling ensured that goods reached distant ports safely. Without this labor, trade would have been far riskier and economic connections slower to develop. Every repeated task, from tightening a sail to inspecting barrels, contributed to the larger machinery of commerce, demonstrating the profound impact of ordinary labor on global systems. Exploration and mapping were also quietly advanced by these crews. Daily observations of stars, currents, and coastlines, recorded in logs and charts, gradually improved maritime knowledge. Navigators, repeating measurements day after day, developed more accurate maps, contributing to safer voyages for future sailors. These incremental contributions, often unnoticed, laid the groundwork for broader exploration and colonization, as well as the eventual expansion of international trade routes. Repetition hour after hour, day after day, was essential to accuracy and survival. Cultural exchange is another subtle but enduring legacy. Ports visited by merchant ships became nodes of interaction, where sailors, merchants, and locals exchanged not only goods but also ideas, customs, and technologies. The crew's disciplined routines, which enabled consistent travel, inadvertently facilitated this diffusion of knowledge. The mundane act of following a schedule, maintaining the ship, and delivering cargo became the vehicle for connections, proving that ordinary labor can have extraordinary consequences. Life at sea also left a mark on maritime practices and ship design. Repeated experience with storms, wear on sails and rigging, and the practical challenges of long voyages informed incremental improvements in shipbuilding, navigation instruments, and safety procedures. Sailors' daily labor provided the empirical knowledge that shaped future vessels, enhancing reliability and efficiency. Even without formal recognition, their hands-on experience directly influenced maritime innovation. Perhaps most importantly, the merchant sailor's legacy demonstrates the power of ordinary human effort to shape history. Their lives were governed by routine, discipline, and repetition, not glory, recognition, or immediate reward. Yet through consistent care, attention to detail, and endurance, they preserved lives, enabled commerce, and contributed to the expansion of human knowledge. The seemingly mundane tasks of scrubbing decks, tying knots, observing the stars, and rationing supplies were, in reality, the foundation of global progress. And still, one is left to ponder how much of the modern world, the global economy, international travel, and cultural exchange depends on invisible labor, performed with diligence and discipline by people whose names are forgotten. How many ordinary routines quietly sustain extraordinary systems, waiting to be appreciated only by those who notice the rhythm behind the flow of history. In the end, the story of the merchant sailor is a reminder that history is not only made in dramatic battles or revolutionary inventions. It is also crafted by countless quiet, repetitive acts by individuals who follow routines, endure hardships, and persist in ordinary tasks whose effects ripple outward, shaping the world for generations to come. You've been listening to Boring Past Times, where the past is quiet, steady, and unhurried. May these stories of forgotten lives and gentle histories ease you into peaceful dreams. Until next time, rest well and remember, History is always waiting, softly, in the background of our world.